1820s, the newly independent Mexico loosened immigration into the Texas region. The area was sparsely populated and vulnerable to raids by indigenous tribes. Immigration was meant to create a buffer between Mexico and the Comanche and develop the region. It worked, and Texas became more economically viable with an influx of settlers. By 1829, some 30,000 Americans had moved there. However, the immigrants soon clashed with the Mexican government over taxes and the abolition of slavery. Even when Mexico restricted immigration, Americans continued to stream in. In 1832, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna came to power through his military exploits. He was popular with his men, in part because he freely encouraged them to loot. Santa Anna was ruthless, and he freely used execution to punish his foes. In the chaos of Santa Anna's rise, the Texans took up arms and forced Mexican soldiers out of East Texas. They then managed to get greater representation in the legislature, and for a few years it looked as if the crisis in Texas had passed. However, in 1835, Santa Anna sought to centralize the government. Militias were outlawed, and legislatures were dissolved. In response, rebellions broke out throughout Mexico. Santa Anna put these down using brutal methods, and massacres were common. Texas, surprisingly, did not at first rebel, but instead sent delegates to discuss matters with Santa Anna. Meanwhile, Santa Anna dispatched 500 soldiers to Texas, led by his brother-in-law, Martin Perfecto de Cos. Before he arrived, Domingo de Ugarchia, who commanded the Texas garrison, tried to seize a cannon at Gonzales. Instead, his troops were defeated in a short skirmish. In reaction, Texans took up arms and went to Gonzales, where the Army of the People was forged. They elected Stephen Austin their commander. In a lightning campaign, Cos was chased across Texas, culminating in his surrender at San Antonio de Bexar in December 1836. The season of easy victories made the Texans confident. Their army, though, suffered from poor discipline and training. The leadership was a mess, as commanders bickered and jockeyed for political position. However, while the Texans lacked supplies and training, they did not lack enthusiasm, and many were great fighters and marksmen. Although they were split on whether to seek independence or merely a redress of grievances, they were united in their opposition to Santa Anna's centralization of the government, increase in taxes, and his desire to end slavery in Texas. Much like the Texan rebels, Santa Anna's Mexican army was of mixed quality. The cavalry was good, but the artillery was antiquated. Infantry regiments varied from men as well drilled as anything in Europe to conscripts and criminals forced into service. In addition, Mexican marksmanship was lacking. Regardless, the Mexicans had more men and quite a few veterans. Most people in Mexico and America thought Santa Anna would reclaim Texas. In the joy of victory, the Texans moved towards independence, starting with the Goliad Declaration of Independence. However, the Texas government dithered. Meanwhile, a group of Texans planned to invade Mexico and take Matamoros. Santa Anna, meanwhile, amassed a force of 6,000 men. Many were raw recruits, and most were armed with older British weapons. With Mexican finances in disarray, the troops were not well supplied, and the men had to resort to stealing. However, Santa Anna brought with him a corps of veterans, and his spy network in Texas gave him accurate information. Still, many died of disease, hypothermia, and from Comanche attacks as they moved towards Texas. Santa Anna's main foe was James Fannin. Fannin came from a family that was divided by the American Revolution. His grandfather dropped the G in his last name to disassociate himself from his loyalist brother. James Fannin was the illegitimate son of Isham Fannin, who served in the War of 1812. Fannin had a tumultuous life. He attended West Point but left for unknown reasons. After serving time in a New Orleans jail, he went to Texas. In less than 9 months after his arrival, he became a noted political and military leader. He raised militia in the revolt's opening days and was at Gonzales. Fannin was a rival of Sam Houston, who commanded the Texan army, but was away, negotiating peace with the Cherokee. For now, Fannin was in command, and he concentrated his forces at Goliad. Fannin warned the government that Santa Anna planned to overrun the country and expel or exterminate every white man within its borders. Fannin believed American recruits could be raised and used against the Mexicans. In this he was correct, as Americans, mostly Southerners, took boats from New Orleans and came to volunteer. Yet, when he asked for more weapons, he was turned down. Lieutenant Governor James W. Robinson told Fannin, "Party spirit lays hold with her infernal fangs." While Fannin held Goliad with 400 men, a smaller Texas force was at the Alamo and San Antonio de Bexar. Governor Smith ordered James Bowie to abandon the position, but he refused, and fighters rallied to his position, including David Crockett. The command was given to William Travis. He implored Fannin to aid him. Instead, Travis was ordered out of the Alamo, but he refused. While Santa Anna closed in on Travis's men, a smaller Mexican force commanded by José de Urrea moved on Goliad. Santa Anna asked Travis to surrender, while implying no quarter would be given. Travis remained defiant. In a letter to the people of Texas, he swore, "Victory or death." Santa Anna besieged the Alamo on February 23rd and waited for heavy artillery to pound the position. Meanwhile, Fannin headed out to relieve the siege, but after a council of war, he withdrew. One reason was Santa Anna had more men, particularly artillery and cavalry. He also believed that Goliad should not be left to Urrea. In addition, Fannin's men suffered from low morale. Many questioned Fannin's abilities, including Fannin himself, who wrote, "If I am qualified to command an army, I have not found out." Santa Anna decided to storm the Alamo to show the Texans the price of rebellion and boost his reputation. When Captain Fernando Urissa protested that the losses would be high, Santa Anna said, "What are the lives of soldiers than so many chickens?" In the early hours of March 6th, the Mexican army gathered while the exhausted Texans fell asleep after days of bombardment. The Mexican preparations were not detected, but when they charged, they yelled out, "Viva Santa Anna!" The Texans woke up, and Travis called out, "Come on, boys, the Mexicans are upon us and we'll give them hell. And don't surrender, boys." Travis was killed early in the fighting, but his men inflicted heavy losses before the defenses were breached. The few prisoners that were taken were executed despite some pleas for clemency from Mexican officers. However, Santa Anna spared the civilians and freed one slave, partially in the hopes of instigating a wider slave revolt. As for the Texan dead, they were burned en masse. The Alamo was costly, with one officer saying, "With another such victory as this, we'll go to the devil." Houston returned and hoped to amass an army. He ordered Fannin to leave Goliad and fall back to Victoria. Fannin, though, failed to move quickly, and as with his push to the Alamo, his preparations were poor. Not until March 19th did Fannin leave Goliad. Although he carried out the fort's weapons, including 9 cannon, not enough water or food was brought along. Against the wishes of his subordinates, Fannin even stopped to let his oxen graze. In contrast, Urrea wasted no time. He was a former Spanish army officer and native of Arizona. He supported Santa Anna, although he disagreed with his harsh treatment of rebels. He was also ambitious, and increasingly Santa Anna did not trust him. After finding out that Fannin had withdrawn, Urrea left his cannon and force marched to catch his prey. Fannin's scouts failed to warn him of Urrea's approach, and near Coleto Creek, Mexican cavalry surrounded Fannin's men. The Texans were only 500 yards from an expanse of timber, which, had they reached it, would have made Urrea's pursuit impossible. The Texans formed a square, with cannon at each corner. Squares were a formation useful against cavalry, but they were compact and susceptible to artillery. Urrea lacked cannon, but he gamely attacked with his infantry, including riflemen and elite grenadiers. Urrea also sent in his cavalry. Fannin had brought every gun out of Goliad, so his men were armed with 3 to 4 muskets apiece. The Texans used preloaded muskets to put up a lot of fire. The Mexicans made 3 attacks. Each was driven back with light losses, although Fannin was among the Texans who were wounded. By sunset, Urrea stopped attacking, but he did order his riflemen to use the tall grass to pick off Texans at dusk. Throughout the night, Urrea had bugles play to keep the Texans awake. Despite this, morale was high. Fannin's men had held off Urrea's best, and many hoped that aid would be on the way. Fannin decided not to retreat that night, fearing for the many wounded who would be left behind. By morning, morale had dipped. The wounded could not be cared for, and they screamed into the night. Food, and particularly water, was low. Although the Texans had plenty of small arms ammunition, the artillery had few shells left. By contrast, Urrea now had cannon, positioned on a nearby height. After a few shots, Fannin parleyed with Urrea. He secured good terms, including treatment for the wounded. Urrea could not guarantee these terms, but he left to speak with Santa Anna. While Urrea left, most of the prisoners were taken back to Goliad. The Battle of Coleto Creek showed that even under a poor leader, Texan soldiers were hardy fighters. Urrea in particular was impressed. The battle was the worst defeat the Texans had yet suffered. With Fannin's surrender, their largest force was taken out of the war, including most of the best trained companies. Urrea's pleas for mercy were rejected. Santa Anna ordered Jose Nicolas de Portilla, who commanded at Goliad, to execute the Texan prisoners. On Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836, Fannin and about 340 other men were shot by Mexican soldiers. They were then placed in shallow trenches and partially burned. News of the massacres of the Alamo and Goliad reverberated through Texas. Panic set in, but many were determined. They knew there would be no quarter and were eager to avenge the Alamo and Goliad. Houston, though, withdrew his 1,400 men. He determined they lacked the training and numbers to take on Santa Anna. In what became known as the Runaway Scrape, Houston moved east towards Louisiana. In the retreat, many deserted, and others called Houston a coward. Urrea's victory at Coleto Creek made Santa Anna jealous, and he worried that his comrade might betray him. Acting President Miguel Barragan had just died, and whoever won the most glory in Texas was likely to succeed him. Santa Anna pushed his force north to catch Houston before Urrea could. Unlike Urrea, Santa Anna held the Texans in contempt and was confident he would easily smash them. Santa Anna's army weakened as they came towards Buffalo Bayou, as men deserted and detachments had to be left behind. Houston discovered Santa Anna's location and knew he had only 1,300 men and one cannon. Before attacking, he gave his men a rousing speech. He extolled them to "Remember the Alamo" and "Remember Goliad." With those battle cries, the 900 Texas rebels overran Santa Anna's camp. The next day, on April 22nd, Santa Anna was captured. Santa Anna agreed to end hostilities to save himself. Urrea was infuriated and wished to continue. He had some 2,500 well-armed men. Vicente Filasola, Santa Anna's second-in-command, overruled him. By June, Urrea and Filasola were gone. The New Mexican government sided with Urrea. Filasola was stripped of command, and Urrea made head of the army. He gathered 6,000 men for another go at Texas, but rebellions elsewhere called him away. Santa Anna, meanwhile, returned in 1837. He and Urrea clashed, but Santa Anna defeated him and had him imprisoned. Urrea returned, though, to fight the French. The peace was uneasy. Border clashes were common, and the Mexican government planned to retake Texas. In 1842, Santa Anna sent an expedition into Texas, failing to retake the area, but causing a lot of devastation. Texas joined with America, and soon after, a dispute on the border led to the Mexican-American War. The Mexicans won no major battles in their fights with America. Santa Anna commanded men in most of the major fights. With the defeat, he went into exile in Jamaica, but returned in 1853 and became president. Santa Anna oversaw the Gadsden Purchase, but was then deposed in 1855. He lived in New York City for years after, until dying in Mexico City, working on his memoirs even as he went blind. The Alamo in time overshadowed Goliad. At the Alamo, the Texans made a valiant but doomed defense. Travis, Bowie, and Crockett became heroes. Fannin, by contrast, was seen as a blunderer, and his command did not die fighting, but instead were murdered. Still, they were not forgotten, at least in 1836. As Filasola withdrew, Thomas J. Rusk, commander of the Texan Army, came upon the massacre site. Bones were strewn about since coyotes had gnawed at the dead. Rusk arranged for a lavish military funeral. He delivered this speech, where he referred to Goliad by its other name, La Bahia. His oration moved men to tears. Fellow soldiers, in the order of Providence, we are this day called upon to pay the last sad offices of respect to the remains of the noble and heroic band, who, battling for our sacred rights, have fallen beneath the ruthless hand of a tyrant. Their chivalrous conduct entitles them to the heartfelt gratitude of the people of Texas, without any further interest in the country than that which all noble hearts feel at the bare mention of liberty. They rallied to our standard, relinquishing the ease, peace, and comforts of their homes, leaving behind them all they held dear, their mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives. They subjected themselves to fatigue and privation, and nobly threw themselves between the people of Texas and the legions of Santa Anna. There, unaided by any reinforcements, and far from help and hope, they battled bravely with the minions of a tyrant, 10-1. Surrounded in the open prairie by this fearful odds, cut off from provisions and even water, they were induced under the sacred promise of receiving the treatment usual to prisoners of war, to surrender. They were marched back, and for a week treated with the utmost inhumanity and barbarity. They were marched out of yonder fort under the pretense of getting provisions, and it was not until the firing of musketry did the shrieks of the dying that they were satisfied of their approaching fate. Some endeavored to make their escape, but they were pursued by the ruthless cavalry, and most of them cut down with their swords. A small number of them stand by the grave, a bare remnant of that noble band. Our tribute of respect is due to them. It is due to their mothers, sisters, and wives who weep their untimely end, that we should mingle our tears with theirs. In that mass of remains and fragments of bones, many a mother might see her son, many a sister her brother, and many a wife her own beloved and affectionate husband. But we have a consolation yet to offer them. Their murderers sank in death on the prairies of San Jacinto, under the appalling words, "Remember La Bahia." Many a tender and affectionate woman will remember, with tearful eye, La Bahia. But we have another consolation to offer. It is that while liberty has a habitation and a name, their chivalrous deeds will be handed down upon the bright pages of history. We can still offer yet another consolation. Santa Anna, the mock hero, the black-hearted murderer, is within our grasp. Yea, and there he must remain, tortured with the keen pain of corroding conscience. He must oft remember La Bahia. And while the names of those whom he murdered shall soar to the highest pinnacle of fame, his shall sink down to lowest depths of infamy and disgrace.